Hidden files, vanished soldiers, and battles that never made it into official history still whisper through time. Some reports describe entire regiments disappearing overnight. Others speak of impossible messages, unexplained movements, and secrets buried so deeply they still challenge historians today. Deep in the folds of the American South, where humid forests give way to quiet, forgotten towns, the story of the lost Confederate gold begins not with spectacle, but with disappearance. In the final days of the American Civil War, as the Confederate government collapsed under pressure in 1865, reports emerged of a small fortune in gold, silver, and Treasury notes being moved under secrecy. The destination, purpose, and ultimate fate of that wealth remain uncertain. Historical accounts place fragments of this story in motion during the evacuation of Richmond, Virginia. As Union forces closed in, Confederate officials are said to have removed financial reserves from the capital. Wagons reportedly carried crates of coins and bullion southward, escorted by remnants of a fading government. Some records suggest the convoy continued toward Danville, then further into Georgia. Beyond that point, documentation grows thin, fragmented, and often contradictory. In Macon, Georgia, a portion of Confederate Treasury funds was officially recorded, but historians disagree on how much remained in circulation and how much was moved again in secrecy. By the time Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured in May 1865, the central authority capable of accounting for the Treasury had effectively dissolved. What remained was a scattered trail of receipts, rumors, and secondhand testimony. Local legends across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama describe buried caches, metal strongboxes hidden in riverbanks, forests, and abandoned plantations. Some accounts speak of soldiers ordered to conceal the treasure to prevent its capture, never returning to retrieve it. Other versions suggest desperate officials divided the wealth into smaller portions, hoping dispersion would increase the chance of survival. Yet the story does not rest solely in official movements or battlefield chaos. In the years following the war, treasure hunters, former soldiers, and local residents reported inconsistencies in the historical record. Why do certain ledgers disappear from archives? Why do witness accounts contradict even basic details such as the size of the convoy or its final destination? These gaps have fueled speculation for over a century. Mainstream historians generally argue that much of the Confederate treasury was either seized by Union forces, spent during the retreat, or lost to poor accounting during the collapse of government infrastructure. Currency inflation, disorganized record-keeping, and the chaos of defeat could easily account for the missing sums. In this view, the lost gold is less a hidden hoard and more a financial illusion born from incomplete documentation. However, alternative theories persist in regional folklore and fringe historical circles. Some suggest coordinated efforts to conceal wealth for future insurgent funding. Others propose that individuals within the Confederate leadership diverted portions of the treasury for private safekeeping abroad or in remote rural deposits known only to a few trusted couriers. No physical evidence has ever confirmed these claims, yet they continue to surface with remarkable consistency across generations. Occasionally, artifacts are discovered: a tarnished coin in a riverbed, a rusted lockbox in an abandoned field, but none have been definitively linked to a larger, intact treasury. Each discovery raises more questions than it answers, reinforcing the sense that something may still lie undiscovered beneath layers of time and soil. And so the story remains suspended between history and uncertainty. Was the Confederate gold truly lost in the chaos of war, or does a portion of it still rest hidden in quiet corners of the American landscape, waiting for chance or persistence to bring it back into the light? Before moving to the next mystery, if you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. If questions remain about what was truly lost in the collapse of the Confederacy, another mystery emerges in its aftermath. One that is not buried in the soil, but in paper torn and vanished. In a quiet archive room in Washington, D.C., under controlled light and careful preservation, rests a small, worn pocket diary. It once belonged to John Wilkes Booth, the actor whose name became inseparable from one of the most consequential moments in American history, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865. The diary is unremarkable at first glance, leather-bound, compact, the kind of object that might once have fit easily into a coat pocket. Yet its significance lies not in its appearance, but in what it no longer contains. Following Booth's fatal capture at the Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia, on April 26, 1865, Union soldiers recovered several personal effects from his body. Among them was this diary. Early examinations revealed something immediately unusual. Several pages had been removed or torn out. The absence was not subtle. It was deliberate in form, yet unexplained in origin. What did those missing pages contain? The surviving entries are fragmented. Brief notes, scattered thoughts, references to movements and intentions. But the gaps interrupt continuity at crucial points in the timeline of Booth's flight after the assassination. Historians have long debated whether the missing sections were removed before his death, during his capture, or in the chaotic handling of evidence afterward. Official explanations suggest practical possibilities. The pages may have been removed by investigators to preserve sensitive information related to accomplices still at large. Some accounts propose that War Department officials examined and extracted material relevant to national security during a moment of extreme political instability. Others argue the simplest explanation, that the pages were lost, damaged, or removed during hurried examination in the field. Yet the uncertainty has always left room for deeper questions. In the decades that followed, fragments of testimony and conflicting reports began to circulate. Some researchers pointed to irregularities in custody records of Booth's belongings. Others noted that key officials involved in the investigation had shifting recollections about when the diary was first opened and reviewed. Was its condition fully documented at the moment of recovery, or did interpretation shape record-keeping after the fact? More speculative theories emerged over time. Some suggest the missing pages may have contained names, possible co-conspirators, correspondences, or references to broader networks of support. Others wonder whether they pointed toward international connections or plans that extended beyond what was ultimately carried out. None of these ideas have been substantiated, yet they persist in historical margins, where gaps in documentation often invite imagination to step forward. The diary itself offers no answers. It remains silent, its torn edges frozen in time, as if the act of removal itself was part of a larger, unfinished sentence. Even modern forensic analysis has been unable to reconstruct what was written or confirm precisely when the pages disappeared. And so the object endures not as a source of clarity, but as a reminder of absence, of how history is often shaped as much by what is missing as by what survives. What, then, was written on those lost pages, and why does their absence continue to echo through the historical record more than a century later? In the lingering wake of unanswered questions surrounding John Wilkes Booth's final movements, another layer of uncertainty emerges, not from physical evidence, but from the fragile boundary between memory, testimony, and myth. In moments like these, history sometimes shifts its weight from what was recorded to what was remembered, or believed to have been remembered. Inside the quiet rooms of the White House in Washington, D.C., during the final months of Abraham Lincoln's life, Accounts describe a man weighed down not only by war, but by an increasingly persistent sense of foreboding. The Civil War was drawing toward its end in 1865, yet for Lincoln, peace did not arrive with ease. The nation was still fractured, the future uncertain, and the cost of unity still unfolding in blood and exhaustion. It is within this atmosphere that one of the most unsettling anecdotes of his final days takes shape. According to recollections attributed to members of his close circle, Lincoln once described a vivid and disturbing dream. In it, he wandered through the White House, unnaturally silent, until he encountered a scene of mourning. Soldiers stood guard. The air was heavy with grief. As he moved deeper into the space, he reportedly discovered a body laid in state, surrounded by sorrowful crowds paying their respects. When he asked who had died, the answer, according to the telling, was not immediate. Only later did he learn it was the president himself. The dream unsettled him. In some accounts, Lincoln dismissed it as the mind's reflection of wartime anxiety, a psychological echo of constant pressure and national suffering. In others, he shared it quietly with trusted aides, noting its clarity and emotional weight. The most frequently cited version of the story comes from recollections recorded after his assassination, particularly in writings attributed to his secretaries and close associates, though the exact details vary between sources. Mainstream historians often interpret this episode cautiously. Dreams of death are not uncommon in periods of prolonged stress, especially for leaders carrying immense political and moral burdens. In Lincoln's case, the Civil War demanded constant attention to mortality on a national scale. In this view, the dream may represent the subconscious processing of relentless reports of battlefield casualties and personal exhaustion. Yet the story did not fade easily. After Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, the dream took on a different tone in public memory. What had once been dismissed as a private mental image began to be revisited with uneasy curiosity. Was it simply coincidence, or did it gain significance only in hindsight? Why did such a detailed account persist across multiple recollections, even as exact wording and timing differed? Some later interpretations moved beyond psychology into the realm of symbolism. The dream, in this reading, becomes less about prediction and more about the emotional truth of leadership during collapse and reconstruction. Others, more speculative in nature, have suggested that certain individuals close to Lincoln believed it carried a warning that was never fully understood in time. These ideas remain unverified, existing on the margins of historical discussion rather than within its center. What complicates the matter further is the nature of memory itself. The accounts of the dream were not written down at the moment they were supposedly shared, but reconstructed afterward through interviews, letters, and retrospective narratives. Each retelling adds subtle variation. Each variation reshapes the image. And so the question lingers in an uncertain space between history and interpretation. Was Lincoln's dream simply the product of a mind burdened by war, later reframed by tragedy into something more symbolic? Or does its persistence in the historical record suggest something about how moments of intense national crisis are later reimagined through the lens of meaning and fate? In the silence that follows, one question remains suspended. Did the dream foretell anything at all, or did history, in its aftermath, teach us to see prophecy where only memory once existed? As the story of Lincoln's final days lingers in the background, where memory, dream, and hindsight begin to blur, another set of documents surfaces from the same turbulent era, carrying its own silence. Not a diary, not a dream, but papers, written, handled, and then, under disputed circumstances, partially lost to history. In the spring of 1864, within the dense woodlands of Virginia near Richmond, a Union cavalry raid led by Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren unfolded under extreme secrecy. The mission was ambitious: a rapid strike intended to destabilize Confederate leadership and, according to some accounts, target the very heart of the Confederate capital. The operation, however, ended in failure. Dahlgren himself was killed during the retreat, and what followed became one of the most controversial episodes of the war. Among the materials reportedly recovered from Dahlgren's body were a set of written orders, later referred to as the Dahlgren Papers. These documents, according to Confederate claims, contained instructions that went beyond conventional military objectives. Some versions alleged references to harsh directives concerning the treatment of Confederate leadership and the destruction of Richmond's infrastructure. The Union command, however, quickly disputed the authenticity and interpretation of these papers. Then, something unusual happened. The original documents, or at least the most controversial portions of them, were never consistently accounted for in the historical record. Confederate authorities publicly displayed copies, fueling outrage and propaganda across the South. Northern officials dismissed them as fabricated or altered, arguing that the language and intent did not align with official Union policy. But amid the political and moral outrage of 1864, verification became difficult. War rarely preserves clarity, and documentation often becomes part of the battlefield itself. What remains firmly established is that the physical chain of custody surrounding the original papers is incomplete. Some reports suggest they were examined, copied, and then withheld. Others imply that portions may have been destroyed to prevent escalation of already volatile tensions. There are also accounts claiming that only fragments ever existed, and that later reproductions amplified or reshaped their contents. Historians largely agree on one point. The papers, in their original form, have never been conclusively verified or fully recovered. Yet the gaps in the record have continued to invite questions. Why do early transcriptions differ so sharply in tone and detail? Why do accounts from opposing sides describe the same documents with such fundamentally different implications? And if the originals did exist in the form described, where did they ultimately go? Over time, the Dahlgren Papers became more than a set of military documents. They transformed into a symbol of contested truth, where documentation itself becomes unstable under the pressure of political necessity. Some interpretations view them as exaggerated wartime propaganda, shaped by urgency and fear. Others suggest that fragments of truth may have been lost amid deliberate suppression or chaotic record-keeping during the final years of the Civil War. And still, no definitive version has emerged to settle the debate. In archives, historians continue to trace references, comparing letters, reports, and secondary copies, hoping to reconstruct what was originally written. But each attempt seems to lead back to the same unresolved tension, the possibility that what is missing may be as significant as what survives. So the question remains, suspended in the quiet uncertainty of historical record. Were the Dahlgren Papers a misinterpreted artifact of war, a deliberate fabrication of circumstance, or a set of documents that once held truths too volatile to preserve intact? Following the fragmented legacy of wartime documents and disputed intelligence, the Civil War leaves behind yet another thread of uncertainty, this time not written on paper, but carried on iron rails through a collapsing nation. A story of movement, urgency, and something that may or may not have vanished into the Southern landscape without ever being fully recorded. In the final weeks of the Confederacy in 1865, as Union forces tightened their grip across the South, rail lines became arteries of survival and escape. Among the most persistent legends of this chaotic retreat is the account of a Confederate treasure transport, a train said to have carried vast quantities of gold, silver, and government assets away from Richmond as the capital fell. The image is striking: a locomotive cutting through mist-laden tracks, its cargo concealed in wooden crates, guarded by exhausted soldiers who may or may not have known the full contents of what they were protecting. According to some accounts, this train was part of a broader effort to preserve Confederate financial reserves as administrative control disintegrated. Other versions suggest multiple transports, moving separately along different routes to reduce the risk of capture. Official records from the period confirm widespread movement of valuables out of Richmond, particularly during the evacuation of the city in April 1865. What remains unclear is the final accounting of those assets and whether all shipments reached their intended destinations. Some historians argue that much of the supposed lost treasure train narrative arises from a combination of fragmented logistics and post-war speculation. The Confederate government, in its final collapse, struggled to maintain coherent financial records. Rail infrastructure was damaged, communication lines were disrupted, and shipments were frequently rerouted or abandoned. In this interpretation, there may never have been a single unified treasure train at all, only overlapping convoys, partial transfers, and incomplete documentation that later merged into a singular legend. Yet the story persists in regional memory. Across parts of Georgia and the Carolinas, oral traditions describe trains that never arrived at their destinations. Some accounts speak of sealed boxcars diverted onto secondary tracks and left in remote rail yards. Others describe deliberate burial of assets near abandoned stations or river crossings, where tracks once faded into overgrown land. These stories vary widely in detail, but they share a common core. Something valuable was moved, and something may have been lost before it could be officially recorded. More speculative interpretations suggest that confusion during the final days of the Confederacy allowed for opportunities beyond simple loss. If multiple transport routes existed, could portions of the cargo have been deliberately separated? Could some shipments have been misdirected in the chaos of retreat, their final destinations never properly documented? These ideas remain unverified, but they continue to surface in local histories and treasure hunting narratives. Modern searches have yielded no definitive evidence of a preserved Confederate treasure train. Railway lines have been dismantled, rerouted, or reclaimed by time. Occasional discoveries, rusted rails, abandoned sidings, forgotten storage depots, fuel renewed curiosity, but none have produced a conclusive link to a missing treasury. And so the image remains suspended in uncertainty, a train moving through a fractured nation, carrying the remnants of a collapsing government, disappearing into a landscape already overwhelmed by war and displacement. Was there ever a single treasure train that vanished intact? Or has time simply layered logistics, rumor, and memory into a story that feels more unified than the reality it came from? As the echoes of vanished trains and uncertain treasuries fade into the broader silence of a war-stricken nation, the focus shifts from what was lost in movement to what was absent in protection itself. In the final chapter of Abraham Lincoln's life, the question is not only how history unfolded, but how easily it was allowed to. Inside Washington, D.C. in April 1865, the city was a place of uneasy transition. The Civil War was nearing its end, and Confederate resistance was collapsing across multiple fronts. Victory for the Union seemed imminent, and with it, a loosening of the intense security measures that had defined wartime leadership. Yet beneath this surface of relief, small details of presidential protection began to change in ways that would later draw quiet scrutiny. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater, a modest building on 10th Street Northwest. The presidential box was arranged in view of the stage, draped with flags and lightly guarded. The atmosphere that night was not one of siege or emergency, but of public normalcy. An audience gathered for performance, a nation briefly exhaling after years of conflict. Historically, Lincoln's protection had evolved throughout the war. Early in his presidency, he traveled with limited security, relying on a small detail of guards and military escorts. Over time, as threats increased, additional measures were introduced, though not always consistently enforced. On the night of his assassination, his primary bodyguard, John Frederick Parker, was assigned to watch the entrance to the presidential box. At some point during the performance, Parker left his post. This fact is well documented. What remains less clear is why. Some accounts suggest Parker had a habit of leaving his station during theater visits, blending personal routine with professional duty in a way that was not uncommon in 19th century security practices. Others point to the relaxed atmosphere of the evening, where perceived threat levels had significantly decreased in the final days of the war. In this interpretation, Lincoln's reduced protection was not a singular failure, but the result of gradual normalization, an easing of caution as victory approached. Yet questions have lingered in historical discussion. Why was security at one of the most visible presidential appearances of the era comparatively minimal? Why were certain precautions, implemented during earlier assassination threats, not fully enforced that night? And how did multiple small lapses converge at precisely the same moment in history? More speculative interpretations, often discussed at the margins of historical inquiry, frame the situation differently. Some suggest that security protocols were in transition during the chaotic final weeks of the war, with unclear chains of command and inconsistent enforcement across federal agencies. Others propose that communication breakdowns and overconfidence in public safety created conditions where vigilance naturally diminished without any single point of failure. There are also interpretations that focus less on conspiracy and more on structural vulnerability, the idea that Lincoln's protection was never designed for the specific risk environment of a post-war capital still adjusting to peace. In this view, the absence of robust, centralized presidential security reflects an era before modern protective systems were fully conceived. And yet, even within these explanations, the timing remains difficult to ignore. A nation transitioning from war to peace, a leader moving in a moment of reduced caution, a security detail that, for reasons both ordinary and uncertain, was not fully in place when it mattered most. In the quiet aftermath of that night, the question persists without resolution. Was Lincoln's missing protection the result of simple human lapse, systemic transition, or a convergence of overlooked details that only appear significant in hindsight? As the story of Lincoln's final hours settles into history, marked by absence, timing, and unanswered gaps, another layer of wartime secrecy emerges from the same fractured era. This time, not from public spaces or battlefield movements, but from the hidden machinery of intelligence itself. In the dim administrative corridors of the collapsing Confederacy in early 1865, scattered references point toward the existence of organized intelligence efforts, informal networks of couriers, coded correspondents, and field operatives tasked with gathering military and political information. Unlike the structured intelligence systems of modern states, these operations were fragmented, improvised, and heavily dependent on personal loyalty rather than centralized archives. And yet, according to several post-war accounts, there were once compiled records, what some later writers referred to as Confederate Secret Service files. These were not standardized documents in the modern sense, but rather collections of reports, intercepted communications, agent summaries, and coded exchanges allegedly gathered across multiple theaters of the war. They were said to contain information about Union troop movements, sympathizers in border states, supply disruptions, and diplomatic contacts abroad. Whether they ever existed as a unified archive, however, remains uncertain. What is more firmly established is that no such comprehensive collection survived the war in any verifiable form. As Richmond fell in April 1865, Confederate administrative structures disintegrated rapidly. Offices were abandoned, records destroyed, and personnel dispersed. In this chaos, many official documents were burned or discarded to prevent capture. It is within this environment that the alleged intelligence files are believed to have disappeared. Some historians argue that the missing files may never have been centralized at all. Intelligence during the Civil War was often decentralized by necessity. Field agents operated independently, and records were frequently kept in personal possession rather than stored in official archives. From this perspective, the notion of a single unified set of Secret Service files may be a retrospective construction, an attempt to impose order on inherently fragmented systems. However, other accounts complicate this interpretation. Post-war testimonies from former operatives and military personnel occasionally reference documents that were allegedly transferred southward during the final retreat. Some suggest that key intelligence materials were entrusted to couriers tasked with moving them beyond Union reach. Others claim that certain records were intentionally destroyed to protect identities of individuals who might have faced prosecution after the war. There are also more speculative interpretations, which propose that portions of these files may have been concealed deliberately, either for future political leverage or personal security. In these accounts, intelligence networks did not simply collapse. They dissolved strategically, leaving behind only fragments that could not easily be reconstructed or traced. What makes the mystery more enduring is the absence of any confirmed recovery. Unlike other lost wartime materials that occasionally surface in archives or private collections, no authenticated Confederate intelligence archive has ever been identified in full. Only scattered references remain, mentions in letters, memoirs, and fragmented post-war investigations. And so the silence itself becomes part of the record. Was there ever a structured Confederate intelligence archive waiting to be preserved? Or did the chaos of war prevent it from ever existing as anything more than scattered documents and human memory? As the narrative of vanished intelligence files fades into the broader silence of wartime secrecy, the focus shifts from what was deliberately hidden by people to what was swallowed by the sea itself, where machinery, courage, and uncertainty descend into darkness with equal weight. Off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, beneath shifting Atlantic currents, lies a reconstructed relic of innovation and desperation, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley. Resting now in preservation, it was once a narrow iron vessel designed for one purpose: to break the Union blockade that choked southern ports during the American Civil War. At just over 40 feet in length, its cramped interior allowed only a handful of crew members, seated shoulder to shoulder around a hand-cranked propulsion system. There was no margin for error, no comfort, and almost no air. On February 17, 1864, the Hunley became the first submarine in history to successfully sink an enemy warship in combat when it attacked the USS Housatonic. The mission was a tactical success, yet what followed was immediate and unsettling. The submarine vanished shortly after signaling victory. It did not return to port. No distress message was received. No confirmed eyewitness account explains its final moments. For over a century, the Hunley remained lost beneath the sea, its fate a subject of speculation and quiet maritime curiosity. When it was finally recovered in 2000, remarkably intact, the physical evidence offered both answers and new questions. The crew remained at their stations, suggesting a sudden and total failure rather than a gradual sinking. Yet what caused it remains a matter of careful interpretation rather than certainty. Mainstream explanations focus on structural and environmental factors. The Hunley operated with early submarine technology, limited oxygen supply, primitive ballast systems, and no reliable means of escape once submerged. Some researchers suggest that the shock wave from its own torpedo detonation may have contributed to catastrophic damage, overwhelming the vessel's structural integrity. Others propose oxygen deprivation, mechanical failure, or flooding caused by hull compromise during the attack or retreat. These interpretations are grounded in engineering analysis and forensic study of the recovered vessel. Yet even within scientific reconstruction, certain details remain open to interpretation. The positioning of the crew, the lack of visible escape attempts, and the timing of its disappearance continue to leave room for uncertainty about the exact sequence of events. Alongside these explanations, alternative perspectives occasionally emerge in broader discussions of maritime history. Some suggest that the Hunley's failure may have involved a combination of unforeseen design vulnerabilities interacting with wartime conditions that could not have been fully anticipated. Others, more speculative in nature, explore whether underwater currents, navigational misjudgments, or external damage from the explosion played a larger role than originally assumed. These ideas remain unverified, existing alongside but separate from established historical consensus. What makes the Hunley particularly compelling is not only its technological significance, but the silence that followed its final mission. Unlike many battlefield losses, there was no retreat, no scattered survivors, no gradual unraveling of events, only disappearance beneath water that concealed all immediate evidence. And so the vessel rests, reconstructed but not fully explained, its final moments still assembled from inference rather than observation. Was the loss of the H.L. Hunley the result of a single catastrophic failure, or a chain of small, invisible events unfolding beneath the ocean's surface, never witnessed, only later imagined through the fragments it left behind? As the silence of the sea closes around the fate of the H.L. Hunley, the narrative returns once again to the land, where memory does not sink but disperses across forests, valleys, and forgotten trails. In these shifting landscapes of Virginia, another Civil War mystery takes shape, carried not by machines or navies, but by riders who moved through darkness itself. Winding through the dense woodlands of northern Virginia are paths once used by Confederate partisan rangers known as Mosby's Rangers, led by Colonel John S. Mosby. Operating during the later years of the war, this small but highly mobile unit became known for rapid raids, intelligence gathering, and sudden disappearances into the terrain they knew intimately. Their operations were unconventional, relying on speed, surprise, and local support rather than traditional battlefield formations. As the war drew toward its end in 1865, Mosby's Rangers conducted numerous raids against Union supply lines and cavalry detachments. Some of these operations reportedly yielded captured goods, cash, equipment, and military supplies taken during ambushes and swiftly relocated before Union forces could respond. It is within this context that the legend of a lost cache begins to emerge. According to post-war accounts and regional oral histories, portions of these captured resources were never formally accounted for after the disbandment of Mosby's unit. As Confederate resistance collapsed, members of the Rangers dispersed, some surrendering, others returning to civilian life, and a few allegedly transporting remaining valuables to undisclosed locations. Mainstream historical interpretation suggests a more grounded explanation. Mosby's Rangers operated in a fluid, decentralized manner. Records were inconsistent, and captured goods were often distributed among individuals rather than stored in centralized depots. In this view, the idea of a single, hidden cache may reflect the aggregation of many smaller, unrecorded transfers rather than one organized deposit of treasure. Yet the persistence of the legend raises additional questions. In rural Virginia, stories have long circulated about buried saddlebags, concealed crates, or hidden compartments along old courier routes. Some accounts describe former Rangers returning quietly to specific locations after the war, possibly retrieving items stored during retreat. Others suggest that certain caches were deliberately left untouched, either forgotten in the chaos of surrender or intentionally concealed to avoid confiscation during Reconstruction. More speculative interpretations expand on these fragments of memory. Could there have been coordinated efforts to preserve captured wealth as a form of future political leverage? Or were these stories shaped over time by the blending of multiple small incidents into a single, larger narrative? The lack of surviving documentation leaves these questions open, with no definitive archive to confirm or deny them. What complicates the mystery further is the nature of Mosby's operations themselves. His unit was designed for mobility and secrecy, leaving behind minimal written records. Orders were often delivered verbally, and movements were intentionally unpredictable. This operational style, while effective during wartime, created conditions where post-war reconstruction of events becomes inherently incomplete. And so the landscape itself becomes the archive: fields, forests, and forgotten crossroads, holding the only remaining traces of what once moved swiftly through them. Was there ever a single identifiable cache hidden by Mosby's Rangers? Or does the mystery persist because history, in this case, was never meant to be fully recorded, only briefly witnessed and then dispersed into the land? As the trails of Mosby's Rangers fade into the quiet of Virginia's forests, another kind of disappearance comes into focus, less visible, but no less significant. This time, the mystery is not carried by riders or buried in the earth, but locked within the administrative core of a collapsing government: its financial records. In the final months of the Confederacy in 1865, as Richmond fell and Union forces advanced, the Confederate Treasury became one of the last functioning institutions attempting to preserve order amid dissolution. Offices were hastily evacuated, clerks dispersed, and financial materials moved under pressure that left little room for careful documentation. Within this chaos, references appear to a body of financial paperwork: ledger books, receipts, correspondence, and accounting summaries that tracked the movement of what remained of the Confederacy's monetary system. These are what later came to be referred to, in historical discussions, as the missing Confederate Treasury documents. Unlike rumors of hidden gold or physical treasure, these were records, paper trails that might have explained where funds were allocated, how resources were distributed in the final phase of the war, and what became of assets during the rapid evacuation of government offices. Their absence is not dramatic in a physical sense, yet their implications are profound. Without them, large portions of Confederate financial history remain reconstructed rather than fully documented. Mainstream historical understanding suggests that the disappearance of these documents was a consequence of necessity rather than concealment. As Union forces closed in, Confederate officials prioritized speed over preservation. Sensitive records were reportedly burned to prevent intelligence compromise, while other materials were abandoned in transit or destroyed during logistical breakdowns. In this interpretation, the missing Treasury documents are not a singular loss, but part of a broader collapse of administrative continuity. Yet the gaps in archival collections remain noticeable. Researchers have identified inconsistencies in post-war financial summaries, particularly in attempts to reconcile Confederate expenditures during its final year. Certain transfers appear without complete documentation, and some reported funds lack corresponding receipts or ledgers in surviving archives. These absences do not confirm deliberate removal, but they do highlight the incomplete nature of the surviving record. This has led some historians and independent researchers to explore alternative explanations. Could portions of the Treasury documentation have been deliberately separated for safekeeping, intended for later reconstruction or political use? Or might individual officials have retained private copies of financial records, either for protection or leverage during the uncertain transition into post-war life? These ideas remain speculative, but they reflect the broader uncertainty surrounding how the Confederacy's administrative system ultimately dissolved. Another perspective considers the possibility that the documents were never centralized in a way that would allow for complete loss or recovery. Confederate financial administration, particularly in its final years, was strained, fragmented, and often reactive. Records may have existed in parallel, scattered across departments and field offices, making the concept of a single missing archive more symbolic than literal. Still, the absence continues to shape historical inquiry. Without complete financial documentation, questions about resource allocation, wartime logistics, and the internal functioning of the Confederacy remain partially unresolved. Each reconstructed estimate carries uncertainty, and each gap in the record invites further interpretation. And so the silence of the archive becomes its own kind of mystery, not marked by discovery, but by what refuses to fully appear. Were the Confederate Treasury documents lost in the urgency of collapse, or do fragments of them still exist, unrecognized, within scattered collections, waiting for context that may never fully return? As the silence of the Confederate cipher systems settles into the uncertainty of what was never fully decoded, the narrative shifts again, this time toward a place where secrecy and medicine, science and war intersect in a far more unsettling form. Not every mystery of the Civil War was buried in documents or lost in code. Some were preserved in bodies, laboratories, and questions that modern analysis still cannot fully answer. In a preserved military medical archive in Washington, D.C., and within scattered field hospital records from 1861 to 1865, there exists a lesser-known but deeply intriguing thread of history: experimental wartime medicine conducted under extreme pressure. Among amputations, infections, and battlefield trauma, Union and Confederate surgeons alike documented unusual physiological responses, unexplained recoveries, and treatments that blurred the boundary between necessity and experimentation. Yet, within these records, historians have noted something more elusive. Not a single missing artifact, but recurring references to treatments and observations that are inconsistently described, partially recorded, or absent from official summaries altogether. These gaps have sometimes been referred to in broader discussions as the lost medical files of the Civil War, though no centralized archive by that name has ever been confirmed. Mainstream historical interpretation offers a grounded explanation. Field medicine during the Civil War was chaotic, overwhelmed by volume and urgency. Record-keeping varied dramatically between units. Many surgeons kept private notes that were never submitted to central authorities. Others lost records entirely during retreat, relocation, or the destruction of makeshift hospitals. In this view, the missing material is less a singular disappearance and more the expected fragmentation of wartime medical documentation. Still, certain inconsistencies remain difficult to ignore. Some surviving journals describe treatments that are only partially detailed, procedures mentioned without full explanation, or outcomes recorded without corresponding methodology. In a few cases, similar symptoms appear across unrelated reports, yet the described treatments differ significantly, as if multiple approaches were being tested simultaneously without coordinated oversight. These fragments raise quiet questions about whether all medical practices of the time were fully documented, or whether some were deliberately left incomplete. This has led some historians and researchers to explore more speculative interpretations. Could certain medical experiments conducted during the war have been intentionally underreported due to their controversial nature or uncertain outcomes? Were some records withheld to avoid scrutiny, either from military leadership or post-war review? These ideas remain unverified, but they reflect the broader uncertainty surrounding wartime medical ethics in an era before modern regulation. Another perspective considers the possibility that what appears missing is actually dispersed. Instead of a single lost archive, the information may exist in fragmented form across countless personal diaries, hospital logs, and pension records, never consolidated and therefore never fully recognized as a coherent body of evidence. If so, the mystery is not disappearance, but invisibility created by scale and disorganization. There are also interpretations that focus on the psychological and environmental conditions of battlefield medicine itself. Surgeons working under extreme stress, limited resources, and continuous influx of casualties may have recorded observations inconsistently, prioritizing immediate survival over documentation. In such conditions, gaps in the historical record become almost inevitable rather than exceptional. And yet, even with these explanations, certain absences remain difficult to fully account for. Why do some accounts reference procedures or outcomes that do not appear elsewhere in the archival record? Why do certain medical narratives seem to begin mid-process, as if earlier context has been lost or never written down at all? The silence in these records is not absolute, but it is uneven, patterned in ways that invite continued attention. Was there ever a coherent body of Confederate cipher-like medical documentation that has since been lost? Or are we instead looking at the natural fragmentation of knowledge under the extreme pressures of war, where even life-saving information becomes incomplete before it is ever fully understood? As the Confederate cipher systems fade into fragmented memory, messages without keys, signals without certainty, the narrative of hidden structures within the Civil War deepens in a different direction. Because not all secrets were carried in words or paper. Some were built into the very ground beneath the cities that shaped the conflict. The setting returns to Richmond, Virginia, Confederate capital, administrative center, and, during the final years of the war, a city under immense pressure from siege, supply shortages, and constant threat of Union advance. Above ground, Richmond was a landscape of government buildings, military hospitals, armories, and crowded streets filled with the movement of war. But beneath that visible surface, another geography is often suggested in historical accounts and local tradition. A network of passages, basements, and concealed routes that may have formed a quieter, less documented layer of wartime movement. These are often referred to collectively as the secret tunnels beneath Richmond. What is historically verifiable is that Richmond, like many 19th century American cities, did contain extensive underground infrastructure. Utility passages, cellar networks, drainage systems, and service tunnels existed to support buildings, supply storage, and water management. Some of these structures predated the Civil War, while others were expanded or modified during it. During wartime, particularly in a capital under siege conditions, such spaces would have taken on additional importance. Government offices required secure storage. Military logistics demanded controlled movement of supplies. Hospitals needed discreet transport of wounded soldiers. In a city under pressure, any existing underground space could potentially become part of a broader system of concealment or efficiency. And it is from this overlap between infrastructure and necessity that the mystery begins to form. Post-war accounts and later historical recollections occasionally reference underground movement within Richmond during the final months of the Confederacy. These references are often vague, descriptions of hidden routes, subterranean passages, or below-ground transport used to move sensitive materials or personnel as Union forces closed in. However, no single unified tunnel system has been definitively documented as a coordinated military network. Instead, what emerges from historical study is a patchwork of structures that may or may not have been connected, depending on location, purpose, and period of use. Mainstream historical interpretation tends to view the idea of an extensive secret tunnel network as an exaggeration of more mundane realities. In this view, Richmond's underground spaces were primarily functional: basements, drainage systems, and utility corridors that were occasionally repurposed during emergencies, but never formed a coherent, purpose-built subterranean system for covert military operations. Yet even within this interpretation, there are moments of ambiguity. During the evacuation of Richmond in April 1865, Confederate forces undertook rapid and disorganized withdrawal operations. Fires broke out across the city, destroying government buildings and archival centers. In such conditions, movement of personnel and materials would have needed to adapt quickly to blocked streets, military congestion, and collapsing infrastructure. It is not difficult to imagine that underground spaces, already existing in fragmented form, may have been used opportunistically to bypass surface disruption. What remains unclear is how extensively such spaces were used and whether their use left any lasting, traceable record. Some accounts suggest that certain officials and military personnel may have used underground routes to move documents, valuables, or sensitive materials during the final evacuation. These claims, however, are difficult to verify, as they often originate from post-war recollections or second-hand narratives written years after the events in question. Other interpretations propose a more restrained explanation, that the idea of secret tunnels is less about a coordinated system and more about the natural tendency of wartime cities to develop layered movement patterns under stress. In this view, basements, service corridors, and partially connected structures could easily be remembered as tunnels in later retellings, especially when direct documentation is absent. Still, the persistence of the idea suggests something more than simple misinterpretation. Richmond's urban evolution over time has obscured many of its 19th century underground features. Construction, redevelopment, and modernization have altered or sealed numerous historical structures. As a result, portions of the city's subsurface environment remain partially mapped or inaccessible, preserved only in architectural records, archaeological surveys, or incidental discoveries during construction projects. Occasionally, workers digging in older districts encounter brick-lined chambers, arched passages, or sealed corridors whose original purpose is not always immediately clear. Most are eventually identified as storage cellars or utility spaces. Some are linked to known historical buildings. Others remain less clearly classified, interpreted through architectural inference rather than complete documentation. These findings have helped sustain public curiosity about whether a more extensive subterranean system once existed, even if not formally organized as a military network. In more speculative historical discussions, the idea of Richmond's underground geography expands further. Some suggest that certain passages may have been deliberately modified during the war to facilitate discrete movement of high-value materials or personnel. Others propose that fear of Union capture may have encouraged ad hoc adaptation of existing structures into temporary concealment routes. There are also more imaginative interpretations found in local folklore and post-war storytelling traditions, where tunnels are described as extending between key government buildings, river access points, and defensive positions. These accounts, while often lacking corroborating evidence, reflect how the pressures of war can transform ordinary infrastructure into perceived systems of secrecy. What complicates any definitive conclusion is the absence of a comprehensive wartime map of Richmond's underground spaces. Unlike above-ground military positions, which were documented in varying degrees of detail, subterranean structures were rarely surveyed in a systematic or unified way during the 1860s. This absence of documentation leaves room for uncertainty, not necessarily about whether underground spaces existed, but about how they were understood, used, and remembered. And so the mystery remains suspended between architecture and memory. Were the so-called secret tunnels beneath Richmond ever part of a coordinated system of wartime movement? Or are they the result of overlapping basements, utility corridors, and emergency adaptations later reinterpreted through the lens of secrecy? And if some of these spaces were used in ways not fully recorded, how much of their history has been permanently lost beneath the layers of reconstruction and time? Like so many features of the Civil War's hidden landscape, they remain beneath the surface, part physical structure, part historical uncertainty, inviting continued exploration into what may still lie unseen below the city that once stood at the center of a collapsing nation. As the underground contours of Richmond fade into questions of structure, memory, and hidden space, the narrative shifts once more, this time away from what lies beneath the city's surface, and toward what was meant to be preserved within its institutions. Because not all disappearances occur through collapse or concealment. Some happen within the very systems designed to safeguard knowledge itself. The setting remains in Richmond, Virginia, but now moves into the administrative and logistical heart of Confederate naval operations during the Civil War. Here, in offices tied to the Confederate Navy Department, records were maintained that documented ship construction, river defenses, blockade running activity, ordnance supply chains, and strategic naval planning along the Atlantic and inland waterways. These were not minor administrative files. They represented the operational memory of a naval force fighting under blockade conditions, an effort to maintain maritime capability despite overwhelming Union naval superiority. In such a context, documentation was essential. Ship specifications, deployment orders, engineering modifications, and logistical correspondence formed the backbone of decision-making in an environment where every vessel, every shipment, and every maneuver carried strategic weight. And yet, as Confederate authority collapsed in April 1865, large portions of Richmond's naval records were not recovered. What remains today are fragments preserved in scattered archives, partial logs, reconstructed correspondence, Union intelligence captures, and post-war compilations assembled from surviving materials. But the original, complete body of Confederate naval documentation from the Capitol appears to have vanished in its entirety. The most widely accepted historical explanation points once again to the final days of Richmond's evacuation. As Union forces approached and Confederate leadership withdrew, government offices were hastily abandoned or destroyed. Fires consumed key administrative buildings, and records deemed sensitive or non-essential were either burned intentionally or left behind in the chaos of retreat. Naval records, which contained detailed information about ship design, harbor defenses, and blockade running routes, would have been considered highly sensitive. Preventing their capture by Union forces would have been a priority. In this context, destruction of such documents would not only be plausible, but expected. However, the absence of complete naval archives raises questions that extend beyond simple wartime destruction. Unlike some other Confederate departments, the Navy Department had maintained relatively structured documentation practices earlier in the war. Shipyards along the James River, including facilities involved in ironclad construction, relied on technical drawings, engineering notes, and correspondence that required careful record-keeping. The CSS Virginia, for example, and other naval projects involved complex design processes that would have generated substantial documentation. Yet none of these records survive in full centralized form. Mainstream interpretation holds that this loss is the result of deliberate destruction during evacuation combined with post-war fragmentation. As Richmond fell, naval personnel reportedly prioritized evacuation of personnel and critical materials over preservation of records. In such a scenario, documents may have been burned to prevent capture or simply abandoned in buildings that were later destroyed or repurposed. Still, this explanation leaves certain inconsistencies unresolved. Some post-war references suggest that portions of naval documentation may have been evacuated alongside Confederate leadership rather than destroyed outright. If this were the case, these materials would have traveled southward during the final retreat, subject to the same instability that affected other Confederate archives. Movement through rapidly disintegrating supply lines, combined with eventual surrender, would have made long-term preservation unlikely, but not impossible. There are also indications that not all naval records were centralized in Richmond alone. Shipyards and naval stations along rivers and coastal regions maintained their own operational files. If these local records were never consolidated into a final central archive before evacuation, then what is missing today may never have existed as a single, unified collection in the first place. From this perspective, the disappearance becomes less a single event and more a structural condition of wartime administration under collapse. Yet the mystery persists because of what the missing records would represent if they were complete. Confederate naval operations, though ultimately outmatched, were highly adaptive. The use of blockade runners, the development of ironclad vessels, and the strategic positioning of river defenses all required ongoing technical coordination. A complete archive of naval records would offer a detailed window into these innovations, decisions, and logistical challenges. Without it, historians are forced to reconstruct naval operations through Union records, surviving Confederate fragments, and later historical synthesis. Each provides partial insight, but none restore the full internal perspective of Confederate naval planning as it existed in real time. This absence creates a kind of historical asymmetry. The Union naval record remains comparatively well documented, while the Confederate perspective is fragmented, inferred, and partially reconstructed from external observation. The result is a narrative shaped not only by what was preserved, but by what was lost. Some researchers have suggested that portions of naval documentation may still exist in unexpected places: private collections, misclassified archival boxes, or foreign repositories connected to wartime trade and diplomacy. Blockade running operations, in particular, involved international routes and intermediaries, meaning that copies or related correspondence could, in theory, have traveled beyond Confederate-controlled territory. Others consider a more restrained possibility, that surviving naval documents exist but are indistinguishable from general administrative records due to lack of clear labeling or incomplete cataloging. In this view, the records were not lost so much as absorbed into larger archival systems without being fully identified. There are also speculative interpretations that arise from the nature of naval warfare itself. Because much of Confederate naval activity depended on secrecy, rapid adaptation, and irregular operations, it is possible that certain aspects were never formally documented in detail. Operational knowledge may have been transmitted verbally or through limited written correspondence that was not preserved in systematic form. If so, then the missing records may reflect not only destruction, but an inherent limitation in how wartime naval operations were recorded under conditions of pressure and uncertainty. What remains undeniable is that gaps persist. No complete Confederate naval archive from Richmond survives today. No single collection offers a comprehensive account of shipbuilding decisions, strategic naval directives, and coordinated river defenses from the capital during the final years of the war. Instead, historians work with fragments, pieces assembled across different institutions, regions, and time periods. And so the question remains open, quietly persistent beneath the surface of archival research. Were Richmond's naval records truly lost in the final destruction of the Confederacy, erased by fire, evacuation, and collapse? Or do fragments of that archive still exist, dispersed across collections, mislabeled holdings, and forgotten repositories, waiting not to be recovered as a whole, but to be recognized in parts that no longer appear connected? Like so many absences left behind by this era, the missing records do not simply mark what is gone. They define the limits of what can still be known. As the missing naval records of Richmond dissolve into archival silence, documents scattered, destroyed, or absorbed into the margins of incomplete history, the narrative shifts once again from institutional disappearance to something more fluid, more elusive. Not records locked in government buildings, but stories carried by men in motion. Soldiers, scouts, and irregular cavalry units whose movements were often faster than the systems meant to document them. The setting now moves into the broader landscape of Confederate cavalry operations in Virginia, where roads cut through dense forests, rolling farmland, and small settlements that became temporary stages for constant movement. Among these units were irregular forces often described in post-war accounts as the Black Horse Cavalry, a name that, depending on the source, referred not to a single formal regiment, but to a loosely associated group of mounted fighters operating in the eastern theater of the Civil War. Historical references to the Black Horse Cavalry are fragmented. Some accounts place them in Loudoun County and surrounding regions, operating as fast-moving mounted troops skilled in reconnaissance, raids, and disruption of Union supply lines. Others suggest that the term was applied more broadly, sometimes even retrospectively, to describe multiple cavalry groups known for aggressive and mobile tactics. What remains consistent across these accounts is the image of speed, secrecy, and intimate knowledge of terrain. These were not large formations moving in predictable lines, but small units capable of disappearing into familiar landscapes and re-emerging where least expected. And it is within this operational style that the legend of a hidden treasure begins to take shape. According to post-war oral traditions and scattered anecdotal references, certain cavalry units operating under Confederate command may have accumulated valuables during raids on Union supply lines or from confiscated goods in contested Monodic. In the chaos of irregular warfare, where official supply chains were often unreliable or absent, captured resources could take on significant importance, not only as immediate provisions, but as portable reserves of value. From this practical reality emerges the idea of a treasure, not necessarily a singular chest of gold, but a concentrated cache of seized currency, valuables, or military pay that was reportedly moved or hidden during the final stages of the war. The Black Horse Cavalry treasure legend, as it is often referred to, does not originate from a single verified document. Instead, it appears in layers of post-war storytelling, local history accounts, and speculative interpretations of guerrilla warfare logistics. Some versions describe buried saddlebags or concealed caches hidden along forest routes. Others suggest that valuable goods were transported southward during the collapse of Confederate lines and never formally recovered. Mainstream historical interpretation tends to view these stories with caution. While it is well documented that cavalry units engaged in foraging, requisitioning, and occasional seizure of supplies during operations, there is no confirmed evidence of a centralized or officially sanctioned treasure associated with Black Horse units. Instead, historians often interpret these legends as the natural byproduct of irregular warfare, where limited documentation and high mobility create fertile ground for retrospective myth-making. Yet the persistence of these accounts invites further examination. In the final year of the war, Confederate cavalry units were operating under increasing strain. Supply shortages, disrupted communication lines, and collapsing administrative structures meant that field units often had to adapt independently. In such conditions, it is not unusual for resources acquired during raids to be temporarily stored or hidden, especially when immediate transport was not possible. Some post-war recollections from veterans and local residents describe instances of buried goods or concealed supplies in wooded areas, though these accounts rarely provide precise locations or consistent details. Over time, these fragmented memories have merged into broader narratives of hidden cavalry wealth. There are also interpretations that suggest the treasure may not refer to accumulated wealth in a literal sense, but rather to strategic materials, documents, codes, or logistical resources hidden to prevent capture. In this reading, the concept of treasure shifts from monetary value to operational significance, blurring the line between material and informational assets. Other perspectives, often rooted in local folklore traditions, expand the idea further. Some stories speak of coordinated concealment efforts by cavalry units retreating through familiar terrain at the war's end, allegedly hiding supplies in locations known only to small groups or individuals. These accounts are typically passed down through generations, often tied to specific regions where Civil War activity was particularly intense. What complicates verification is the nature of cavalry warfare itself. Units operating in small, mobile formations rarely generated detailed logistical records for every action. Combined with the destruction of Confederate administrative archives in the war's final collapse, this creates a historical environment where gaps are inevitable. It is within these gaps that legend takes hold. Modern historical research has occasionally attempted to cross-reference these stories with known cavalry movements, supply records, and wartime correspondence. While some correlations exist between areas of heavy cavalry activity and later reports of buried or lost items, no definitive link has been established that would confirm the existence of a coordinated treasure associated specifically with Black Horse units. Still, the idea persists, partly because it reflects a broader truth about irregular warfare, that the boundaries between official military operations and improvised survival strategies are often difficult to distinguish in retrospect. The terrain itself adds another layer to the mystery. Northern Virginia and surrounding regions have undergone significant environmental and infrastructural change since the 1860s. Forests have regrown, fields have been repurposed, and roads have shifted. Any physical remnants of temporary wartime concealment would be subject to decades of natural and human transformation, making discovery increasingly unlikely without precise historical coordinates. And yet, occasional discoveries of Civil War-era artifacts, buttons, coins, equipment fragments, continue to surface in areas once traversed by cavalry units. While these finds are typically small and isolated, they serve as reminders that the physical traces of movement and conflict have not entirely disappeared. So the question remains open. Was there ever a coherent Black Horse cavalry treasure in the sense suggested by legend? Or are we looking at the convergence of many smaller, practical acts of concealment and resource management that were later reshaped into a singular narrative? And if such caches did exist, were they ever meant to be recovered, or simply left behind as part of a rapidly dissolving wartime world? Like so many mysteries of the Civil War, it exists not as a fixed point in history, but as a pattern of absence, where movement is known, outcomes are uncertain, and the line between fact and memory continues to shift with time. As the legend of the Black Horse Cavalry fades into the mist of moving horsemen and uncertain caches, the narrative shifts once again, away from irregular raids and rumored spoils, and toward something far more structured in appearance, yet equally vulnerable to disappearance. Not the improvised fortunes of guerrilla warfare, but the formal machinery of a government attempting to sustain an army in the midst of collapse. The setting moves to the late stages of the American Civil War, where Union forces are advancing deeper into Confederate territory and administrative systems are under extreme strain. In this environment, military payrolls represented more than simple transactions. They were lifelines, physical currency meant to sustain soldiers in the field, maintain loyalty, and keep fragmented units operational as the Confederacy weakened. These payroll shipments typically consisted of gold coin, paper currency, or bonds, transported under guard along established supply routes. In theory, their movement was carefully recorded: who carried them, when they departed, and where they were intended to arrive. In practice, however, the final months of the war were anything but orderly. It is within this unstable environment that the story of a lost Union payroll shipment emerges. Unlike many Civil War mysteries rooted in Confederate collapse, this account shifts perspective to the Union side, where logistics were more stable but still vulnerable to disruption in contested regions. Historical records confirm that payroll transport was a recurring necessity, particularly for troops operating far from central depots. Cash payments were often moved by military escort, sometimes over long distances and through territory still experiencing sporadic resistance. In one such instance, referenced indirectly in fragmented military correspondence and later recollections, a significant payroll shipment is believed to have gone missing during transport in the final year of the war. The details, however, remain inconsistent across sources. Some accounts describe a courier escort carrying funds intended for Union troops stationed in forward positions. Others suggest a larger logistical transfer moving through Southern transportation routes that had only recently come under Union control. In all versions, the essential element remains the same: a shipment of military payroll that never reached its documented destination. Mainstream historical interpretation tends to attribute such losses to the chaos of wartime logistics. As Union forces advanced, supply lines stretched across newly secured territories where infrastructure was damaged, communication systems were unreliable, and local conditions varied dramatically from region to region. In such an environment, delays, misrouted shipments, or administrative errors would not have been uncommon. Yet the idea of a lost payroll persists because it touches a critical vulnerability in wartime systems: the physical movement of value across unstable ground. Military payrolls were not abstract accounting entries. They were tangible, transportable assets, often carried in sealed containers or strongboxes, guarded by small detachments whose primary responsibility was secure delivery rather than combat engagement. This made them both essential and, under certain conditions, exposed. Some historical interpretations suggest that environmental and logistical factors alone could account for such a disappearance. Ambush was always a risk in transitional territories, even late in the war. Roads could be compromised, escorts could be dispersed, and documentation could be lost in the confusion of movement between commands. However, there is also the possibility that administrative fragmentation played a role. As Union forces expanded into former Confederate regions, overlapping jurisdictions and rapidly shifting command structures sometimes created gaps in record continuity. A shipment recorded at departure might not be properly logged upon arrival, especially if transferred between units or reissued under different administrative authority. This opens the door to a quieter but significant form of disappearance, not physical loss, but bureaucratic dissolution, where a shipment ceases to exist clearly within the record even if it was physically delivered or partially redistributed. Yet some accounts go further, describing scenarios in which payroll shipments were physically intercepted or diverted. While confirmed examples of large-scale payroll theft during the Civil War are rare, smaller incidents of supply loss and interception did occur throughout the conflict. In contested regions where control of territory shifted repeatedly, the distinction between official transport and opportunistic seizure could become blurred. In such cases, a lost payroll might not vanish suddenly, but rather be absorbed into a sequence of smaller, unrecorded events: partial recoveries, undocumented redistribution, or loss of accountability during transition between military units. What complicates this particular mystery is the absence of a definitive archival resolution. Unlike other logistical failures that were later documented and explained in military reports, this shipment remains referenced only indirectly, without a complete accounting of its contents or final disposition. Some researchers suggest that the lack of clarity itself reflects the administrative pressures of the period. As the war drew to a close, attention shifted rapidly toward demobilization, reconstruction planning, and the broader transition from wartime to peacetime governance. In such a climate, isolated logistical losses may not have been fully investigated or prioritized for historical preservation. Other interpretations consider the possibility that the shipment was deliberately rerouted or reallocated under emergency conditions. In wartime, financial resources were sometimes redirected to meet immediate operational needs, especially in rapidly changing theaters of conflict. If such a decision occurred without formal documentation, it could result in a permanent gap in the historical record. There are also more speculative perspectives, which suggest that the payroll may have been hidden or temporarily secured during a moment of crisis and never formally recovered. In this view, disappearance becomes a product of interrupted process rather than loss or theft, a shipment suspended in administrative uncertainty during the collapse and reorganization of military systems. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the uncertainty surrounding its final state. No surviving document conclusively identifies where the payroll ended, whether it was delivered, absorbed, lost, or redirected. Instead, historians are left with partial references, implied movements, and the absence of closure in the archival record. And so the question remains open. Was the lost Union payroll shipment a victim of wartime chaos, an administrative gap in a rapidly expanding military system, or an event that unfolded in ways never fully recorded by those responsible for documenting it? And if it did survive in some form, delivered, redistributed, or concealed, would it still be recognizable today within the fragmented records of a war that stretched every system of accountability to its limits? Like so many mysteries of this era, it does not rest on a single moment of disappearance, but on the quiet erosion of certainty within systems built to function under conditions they were never fully prepared to endure. As the story of the lost Union payroll shipment fades into questions of movement, accounting, and the fragile reliability of wartime logistics, the narrative turns once again toward the other side of the conflict, toward institutions strained not only by supply shortages, but by the immense cost of sustaining a navy built under blockade and pressure. The setting returns to Richmond, Virginia, and the broader administrative network of the Confederate Navy Department during the Civil War. Here, amid government offices, dockyards along the James River, and coastal coordination centers, financial resources were constantly being allocated, redirected, and stretched across an increasingly unstable system. Naval warfare was one of the most resource-intensive aspects of the Confederate war effort. Ironclad construction, blockade runner procurement, river defense systems, ordnance supply chains, and shipyard operations all required continuous funding. Unlike land forces that could sometimes rely on local requisitioning or temporary supply solutions, naval operations demanded sustained industrial and financial input. To manage this, the Confederate Navy Department maintained financial records that tracked expenditures, payments to contractors, procurement of materials, and operational costs associated with maintaining vessels and infrastructure. These funds were not symbolic. They were functional, determining whether ships could be built, repaired, or deployed at all. And yet, as Confederate administrative control collapsed in the final months of the war, references to certain naval funds become increasingly difficult to trace. The mystery of the missing Confederate Navy funds does not begin with a single documented theft or confirmed loss. Instead, it emerges from the gradual breakdown of financial continuity in the Confederate naval system during 1864 and 1865. As Union forces advanced and key ports and river systems came under pressure or capture, the ability to maintain centralized financial oversight weakened significantly. Historical records confirm that Confederate naval operations continued until the final stages of the war, including efforts to sustain blockade running and river defenses. These operations required ongoing financial support, often managed through rapidly shifting administrative channels. Funds were issued, transferred, and sometimes moved under conditions that prioritized urgency over documentation. In this environment, financial transparency became increasingly difficult to maintain. The most widely accepted historical explanation for the disappearance of certain Confederate naval funds points to a combination of wartime expenditure, administrative disorganization, and physical destruction of records during the evacuation of Richmond in April 1865. As government offices were abandoned or burned, financial ledgers and Treasury documents related to naval operations were likely destroyed or left incomplete. However, this explanation, while consistent with broader patterns of Confederate record loss, does not fully resolve all inconsistencies in surviving references. Some post-war accounts suggest that portions of naval funds may have been evacuated alongside Confederate officials during the final retreat southward. If this occurred, these funds would have been subject to extreme instability, transported through collapsing infrastructure, shifting command structures, and rapidly deteriorating logistical conditions. In such circumstances, financial assets could have been divided, reassigned, or absorbed into other operational needs without formal documentation. The urgency of survival and movement may have overridden the requirement for detailed accounting. There are also indications that Confederate naval financing was not always centralized, even during more stable periods of the war. Regional commands, shipyards, and blockade-running operations often managed funds semi-independently, relying on local networks of supply and payment. This decentralization, while practical under wartime constraints, created inherent vulnerabilities in long-term record preservation. From this perspective, the missing funds may not represent a single unified pool of money that vanished, but rather a dispersed financial system whose final state was never fully recorded. Still, gaps remain in the historical record that invite further inquiry. Some references in surviving correspondence hint at unexplained shortfalls in naval accounts during the final months of the war. These references are often indirect, mentions of delayed payments, incomplete settlements with contractors, or unresolved balances tied to shipbuilding and repair operations. While none of these explicitly confirm a large-scale disappearance, they suggest a level of financial uncertainty that was never fully reconciled. Mainstream interpretation attributes these inconsistencies to the breakdown of Confederate administrative capacity under extreme wartime pressure. As the Confederacy neared collapse, record-keeping systems were overwhelmed by operational demands, making comprehensive financial reconciliation increasingly difficult. Yet, alternative interpretations explore other possibilities. One view suggests that some naval funds may have been deliberately redirected to urgent military or governmental needs without formal documentation. In a collapsing system, financial resources could have been reallocated quickly to support evacuation efforts, sustain remaining naval assets, or fund critical defensive operations. Such actions, if undertaken without record preservation, would create lasting gaps in financial history. Another perspective considers the possibility that certain funds were physically transported during evacuation but lost in transit due to the chaotic conditions of retreat. In this scenario, financial assets, whether in coin, currency, or negotiable instruments, would have moved alongside personnel and documents, exposed to the same risks of fragmentation, capture, or abandonment. There are also more speculative interpretations, often emerging from the broader mythology of Civil War losses, that suggest portions of Confederate naval funds may have been concealed intentionally. Whether hidden to prevent Union capture or stored temporarily with the intention of later recovery, such actions, if they occurred, would have required conditions that were rapidly disappearing as the war ended. What complicates any definitive conclusion is the absence of a complete financial archive for Confederate naval operations. Unlike modern naval accounting systems, which maintain centralized and redundant records, Confederate financial documentation was vulnerable to destruction, fragmentation, and loss during the collapse of governmental infrastructure. As a result, historians are left reconstructing naval financial activity through partial ledgers, correspondence, contractor records, and Union intelligence reports that reference Confederate expenditures indirectly. Each source provides insight, but none offers a complete financial picture. And so the mystery remains unresolved. Were the missing Confederate Navy funds lost through destruction and administrative collapse during the fall of Richmond? Were they dispersed across retreating networks, absorbed into emergency wartime expenditures, or never fully centralized in a way that allowed for coherent recovery? Or do fragments of those financial records still exist today, scattered across archives and private collections, unrecognized as part of a larger and incomplete system? Like so many unresolved elements of this period, the answer may lie not in a single discovery, but in the realization that wartime financial systems under collapse do not always end with clear lines of closure. Instead, they dissolve gradually into fragments, absences, and unanswered entries that remain suspended in the historical record. As the unresolved questions surrounding Confederate naval finances fade into fragmented ledgers and incomplete wartime accounting, the narrative shifts once again, away from numbers and systems, and toward a single moment on a battlefield where leadership, timing, and fate converged in a matter of minutes. Because sometimes, the most enduring mysteries are not about what was lost in archives or transport routes, but about what happened in the final breath of a life that shaped an entire campaign. The setting moves to southwestern Tennessee, near the banks of the Tennessee River, on April 6, 1862. The place is Shiloh Church, also known as the Battle of Shiloh, a quiet wooded area that, for 2 days, became one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in the early Western theater of the American Civil War. Dense forest, uneven terrain, and scattered clearings formed a landscape where visibility was limited and command decisions had to be made under extreme pressure. It is here that General Albert Sidney Johnston, one of the most senior and respected commanders of the Confederate Army, met his end. At the time, Johnston was leading Confederate forces in an attempt to strike Union troops under General Ulysses S. Grant before they could fully consolidate their position. The plan depended on speed and coordination, elements that were already strained by terrain, communication delays, and the sheer scale of the engagement unfolding in the wooded landscape. Johnston himself was known for his presence on the battlefield. Unlike commanders who remained behind lines of engagement, he moved closer to the front, observing troop movements directly and attempting to maintain cohesion in rapidly shifting conditions. This decision placed him within range of active combat at Shiloh. At some point during the battle, Johnston was struck by a gunshot wound behind the knee. The injury severed a major artery, and he bled to death within minutes. He was found still mounted, though accounts differ slightly on the exact circumstances of his final moments. His death occurred quickly, without prolonged treatment or evacuation. And yet, despite the apparent clarity of the medical cause, the circumstances surrounding his death have generated enduring questions. One of the most widely discussed aspects of Johnston's death is the absence of immediate medical attention. It is historically documented that Johnston did not carry a personal tourniquet or assign a dedicated medical officer to remain with him at all times, despite his high rank. Some accounts suggest that a personal physician had been assigned, but was not present at the critical moment. Others indicate that battlefield conditions made rapid medical intervention nearly impossible due to ongoing combat intensity. Mainstream historical interpretation attributes his death to a combination of battlefield chaos, delayed recognition of injury severity, and the overwhelming scale of simultaneous engagements across Shiloh. In this view, Johnston's death, while tragic, is consistent with the realities of 19th century warfare, where even high-ranking officers were vulnerable to sudden and fatal injury. However, certain details in eyewitness accounts have continued to draw attention. Reports from soldiers present at the scene describe Johnston continuing to move after being wounded, with initial signs of injury not immediately perceived as life-threatening. Some accounts suggest that he may not have realized the severity of his wound at the moment it occurred, continuing to direct movement before collapsing. Others indicate that attention was diverted by ongoing combat activity, delaying awareness of his condition. There are also inconsistencies in descriptions of the exact moment and location where he fell. While the general area is known, variations in testimony have led historians to reconstruct multiple plausible sequences of events leading up to his death. From these inconsistencies, alternative interpretations occasionally emerge, not as claims of conspiracy, but as explorations of uncertainty within battlefield conditions. Some historians have considered whether communication breakdowns among staff officers may have delayed critical medical response. In the chaos of Shiloh, command structures were fluid, and information often traveled slowly between units. If Johnston's condition was not immediately communicated across his command network, even short delays could have had fatal consequences given the nature of his injury. Others have examined the possibility that Johnston's proximity to active combat zones may have limited the ability of aides to safely reach him in time. The density of engagement in the area meant that movement between positions was often hazardous, even for trained personnel. There are also more speculative reflections found in post-war writings and later interpretations, where Johnston's death is sometimes framed within broader questions about leadership vulnerability and the unpredictability of battlefield fate. In these interpretations, the focus shifts away from physical cause and toward the structural realities of command in 19th century warfare, where even the most experienced generals operated within systems that could not guarantee protection or rapid medical response. What remains consistent across all accounts is the speed of his death and the limited opportunity for intervention. Unlike modern battlefield medicine, where structured evacuation and trauma care can alter outcomes, Civil War conditions offered little margin for survival once major vascular injury occurred. Johnston's death had immediate strategic consequences. His loss during active combat disrupted Confederate command cohesion at Shiloh at a critical moment, contributing to shifts in momentum that would shape the remainder of the battle. In this sense, the event is not only a personal tragedy, but also a turning point within the broader military narrative. And yet, despite its clear historical impact, the precise micro-moments surrounding his final minutes remain partially obscured by the limitations of eyewitness memory, battlefield confusion, and the absence of precise medical documentation. This is where the mystery endures, not in the fact of his death, which is undisputed, but in the layered uncertainty of how quickly it was understood, how effectively it was responded to, and how differently the battle might have unfolded had circumstances allowed for immediate intervention. Was General Albert Sidney Johnston's death simply the unavoidable result of severe battlefield injury under extreme conditions? Or does the variation in accounts reflect something deeper about the limits of command, perception, and response in moments where information itself breaks down? Like so many figures of the Civil War, his final moments remain suspended between documented fact and interpretive uncertainty, anchored in history, yet still open to reflection on what could not be fully seen, recorded, or prevented in the chaos of battle. As the account of General Albert Sidney Johnston fades into the silence of Shiloh's wooded ground, where even decisive moments blur under the weight of chaos, the narrative shifts once more. This time, away from the final moments of commanders whose names are recorded in history, and toward those whose identities were never fully secured in the first place. Not the known dead of the Civil War, but the unknown, those whose names were never matched to their resting places, even in the aftermath of one of the conflict's most studied battles. The setting moves northward to Pennsylvania, to the fields surrounding Gettysburg. Rolling farmland, stone walls, orchards, and gentle ridges formed a landscape that, for 3 days in July 1863, became the stage for one of the most decisive and devastating battles of the American Civil War. When the fighting ended, the terrain was transformed, visibly scarred by artillery, trenches, and hastily dug graves. In the immediate aftermath, thousands of soldiers lay dead across the battlefield. Some were identified quickly by comrades or recovered belongings. Others were buried in shallow graves near where they fell, often marked only by crude indicators or left entirely unmarked in the urgency of post-battle conditions. It is from this chaotic burial process that the mystery of the unidentified dead of Gettysburg emerges. Historical records confirm that both Union and Confederate forces undertook burial operations after the battle, but the scale of the casualties made systematic identification extremely difficult. Decomposition, lack of personal identification systems, and the rapid nature of burial efforts meant that many soldiers were interred without their names being recorded. In the years that followed, efforts were made to recover and properly reinter remains, most notably through the establishment of national cemeteries. The Gettysburg National Cemetery became a central site for Union burials, while Confederate dead were gradually relocated to other cemeteries or remained in scattered battlefield graves. Yet despite these efforts, a significant number of individuals remain unidentified to this day. Mainstream historical interpretation attributes this to the limitations of 19th century identification practices. Soldiers did not have standardized identification tags, and personal effects were often lost in the intensity of combat. Uniforms could become indistinguishable after days in the field, and battlefield conditions frequently destroyed any remaining identifiers. In many cases, burial parties relied on battlefield location, unit markings on equipment, or oral identification by surviving comrades. When none of these were available, a soldier might simply be recorded as unknown. However, what makes Gettysburg particularly notable is not only the number of unidentified remains, but the persistence of uncertainty despite extensive post-war efforts to resolve them. Over the decades following the battle, reinterment projects attempted to locate, exhume, and reclassify remains across the battlefield. Yet even with improved record-keeping and archaeological methods, a portion of those who died in July 1863 remain without definitive identification. This enduring anonymity has led historians and researchers to examine the conditions that made identification so difficult at Gettysburg compared to other Civil War battles. The scale of the engagement is one factor. Gettysburg involved massive troop movements across a wide geographic area, with fighting occurring in multiple phases over several days. Soldiers were frequently repositioned, and the intensity of combat meant that bodies were often left in exposed or rapidly changing conditions. Environmental factors also played a role. The July heat accelerated decomposition, complicating later identification efforts. Rain, scavenging animals, and subsequent movement of remains during burial operations further disrupted the preservation of identifying features. But beyond these practical explanations lies a quieter and more persistent question. What happens when the systems of identification themselves are insufficient for the scale of loss? In modern analysis, the unidentified dead of Gettysburg are often seen as a reflection of the limitations of Civil War-era record-keeping and medical legal practices. There was no centralized system for tracking individual soldiers in real time, and no standardized method for post-mortem identification that could withstand the conditions of large-scale battlefield death. Still, within historical and cultural memory, these unknown soldiers occupy a more ambiguous space. They are not absent from the record entirely. They are acknowledged, counted, and buried, but their individual identities remain suspended, unassigned to names that can be recovered. This has led some researchers to consider whether certain unidentified remains may still be recoverable through modern forensic methods. Advances in DNA analysis, isotopic testing, and archaeological recovery techniques have, in recent years, provided new possibilities for identifying historical remains. However, the passage of more than 150 years, combined with the condition of many burial sites, makes comprehensive identification unlikely. There are also instances where remains have been relocated multiple times, particularly during 19th century reinterment efforts. Each movement introduced additional opportunities for loss of contextual information, further complicating identification efforts. From a broader perspective, the unidentified dead of Gettysburg also highlight the scale of anonymity inherent in industrialized warfare. Even in one of the most documented battles of the Civil War, where maps, reports, and eyewitness accounts are abundant, individual identity can still dissolve into statistical record. And yet, the absence of names does not erase presence. Each unidentified soldier represents a life that moved through a moment of history so concentrated and chaotic that personal identity could not be fully preserved in its aftermath. They are recorded collectively, but not individually, a distinction that continues to shape how the battle is understood today. Some interpret this anonymity as an unavoidable consequence of war at that scale. Others view it as a reminder of the limits of historical documentation itself, where even well-studied events contain spaces that resist complete recovery. Occasionally, efforts are made by historians and genealogists to reconnect unknown remains with possible identities, using unit records, battlefield locations, and historical inference. Some cases have yielded probable identifications, though certainty remains rare and often dependent on circumstantial alignment rather than definitive proof. And so the majority remain as they were recorded in the years immediately following the battle. Unknown soldiers, resting in marked and unmarked graves across Gettysburg. The question that remains is not simply how many could not be identified, but whether all possible methods of identification have already been exhausted, or whether some identities still exist, waiting not in physical remains alone, but in overlooked records, fragmented family histories, or data yet to be fully interpreted. Like so many mysteries of the Civil War, it is not defined by what is missing in isolation, but by what remains just beyond the reach of certainty, even in one of the most extensively studied landscapes of American history. As the unidentified dead of Gettysburg fade into the silent rows of national cemeteries and unmarked ground, the narrative does not settle. Instead, it shifts, away from the physical remains of those who could not be named, and toward something even more elusive. Not bodies left behind, but presence remembered in absence. Not records of death, but accounts of what seemed to linger afterward. The setting remains Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But now the landscape is no longer defined by the violence of July 1863 alone. It is defined by what came after, years, decades, and generations of reflection layered over the same fields, ridges, and stone walls where thousands once fought and fell. By the late 19th century, Gettysburg had become more than a battlefield. It had become a memorial landscape. Monuments rose across Cemetery Hill, Little Round Top, and the wheat field. Veterans returned for reunions. Visitors walked the grounds, seeking to understand the scale of what had occurred there. The physical scars of battle slowly softened under grass and time, but memory remained sharply preserved. And it is within this landscape of memory that accounts of the ghost soldiers of Gettysburg begin to appear. These accounts do not originate from official military records or battlefield reports. Instead, they emerge gradually from personal testimonies, local stories, and later historical recollections, descriptions of unexplained sights and sensations reported by visitors, caretakers, and occasionally veterans returning to the site long after the war had ended. Some accounts describe distant figures seen moving across fields at dusk, only to vanish when approached. Others speak of faint sounds, marching footsteps where no troops are present, or the echo of distant commands carried across open ground. There are also reports of more static impressions, shapes resembling soldiers standing motionless near tree lines or stone structures, visible for moments before disappearing into the shifting light. Mainstream historical interpretation treats these accounts with caution, often attributing them to psychological suggestion, environmental conditions, or the powerful emotional weight of the site itself. Gettysburg is, after all, a place where memory is intensely concentrated. The combination of historical awareness, visual landscape, and expectation can shape perception in subtle and powerful ways. Light conditions across open fields, atmospheric distortion at dusk, and the human tendency to interpret ambiguous shapes as familiar forms all offer plausible explanations for many of the reported sightings. Yet what keeps the idea of ghost soldiers present in cultural memory is not a single event, but the consistency of scattered reports over time. Across different decades and from unrelated individuals, similar descriptions reappear. Figures in uniform seen briefly and indistinctly, sounds of movement without visible source, and an enduring sense of presence in areas known to have experienced intense combat. Some interpretations suggest that these experiences are not literal sightings of the past, but rather psychological responses to historically charged environments. In this view, Gettysburg functions as a powerful mnemonic landscape, where the mind reconstructs fragments of memory, history, and imagination into perceived experience. Others take a more symbolic approach, viewing the ghost soldiers not as physical or supernatural entities, but as manifestations of collective remembrance. In this interpretation, the term ghost reflects the persistence of historical trauma within cultural consciousness, rather than the presence of unresolved physical phenomena. There are also more speculative perspectives, often found in local folklore and popular storytelling, which suggest that certain conditions at Gettysburg allow for fleeting impressions of past events to become perceptible under rare circumstances. These accounts tend to describe moments when time feels layered, or when historical scenes seem to briefly overlap with present reality. While such interpretations fall outside conventional historical methodology, they persist as part of the site's broader narrative identity. What makes Gettysburg particularly fertile ground for these stories is not only the scale of the battle, but the degree to which the landscape remains visually recognizable. Many key locations have been preserved or restored to reflect their historical appearance. This continuity between past and present allows visitors to mentally reconstruct the events with unusual clarity, reinforcing the emotional intensity of the site. In this sense, the ghost soldiers may be understood less as anomalies within the environment and more as extensions of how memory interacts with place. The battlefield becomes a space where historical imagination is constantly active, shaped by education, storytelling, and personal reflection. Still, certain accounts resist simple dismissal. Visitors have occasionally reported experiences that align too closely across time and context to be easily reduced to coincidence. Descriptions of uniformed figures appearing in areas known for heavy fighting recur in different eras, long after the immediate cultural memory of the battle had begun to fade. While none of these accounts provide verifiable evidence, their repetition contributes to the enduring nature of the legend. It is also worth noting that Gettysburg is not unique in this respect. Many historic battlefields around the world are associated with similar reports of residual presence or unexplained phenomena. However, Gettysburg's combination of documentation, preservation, and public engagement makes it one of the most extensively observed and discussed examples, and so the question remains open, suspended between interpretation and experience. Are the ghost soldiers of Gettysburg simply the product of expectation, environment, and the human mind's relationship to memory under emotionally charged conditions? Or do these recurring accounts reflect something more complex about how places of extreme historical intensity continue to be perceived long after the events themselves have ended? Like so many mysteries tied to this landscape, the answer does not settle into certainty. Instead, it remains in motion, echoing across fields that are no longer active battlefields, but are never entirely separated from the events that once defined them. As the ghost soldiers of Gettysburg fade into the broader landscape of memory, interpretation, and emotional projection, the narrative shifts once again, away from figures seen in open fields and toward something even more subtle. Not what appears in the landscape, but what seems to move through it when no one is certain of what they have witnessed. Not bodies, not silhouettes, but impressions, moments where presence feels inferred rather than observed. Gettysburg, by this point in its long historical afterlife, is no longer just a preserved battlefield. It is a structured environment of memory. Trails guide visitors through carefully marked routes. Monuments define sightlines. Interpretive signs anchor imagination to documented fact. And yet, even within this highly organized space, reports continue to emerge, quiet, inconsistent, and difficult to categorize within any single framework of explanation. These accounts often do not begin with certainty. They begin with hesitation, a visitor pausing mid-step, a park worker noticing something briefly out of place in peripheral vision, a moment where sound, light, and expectation do not fully align. In most cases, the experience is fleeting, too brief to document, too ambiguous to confirm, yet distinct enough to be remembered. Mainstream interpretation returns, as it often does in such contexts, to the interaction between perception and environment. Gettysburg is a landscape where visual familiarity is high and historical expectation is constant. Visitors arrive already aware of what occurred here. That awareness shapes attention. It narrows focus toward patterns that resemble human presence, especially under changing light conditions across open fields, tree lines, and stone structures. The human brain, under these conditions, is highly effective at completing incomplete information. A shifting shadow becomes a figure. A rustling sound becomes movement. A brief distortion in distance becomes something momentarily recognizable before it resolves or disappears into normal environmental variation. And yet, what complicates simple dismissal is the persistence of certain patterns in these accounts. Descriptions of brief, human-like movement often recur in areas associated with documented troop positions or heavy engagement during the battle. Visitors who have no prior detailed knowledge of the terrain sometimes report experiences that later align, loosely but intriguingly, with historically significant locations. While none of this constitutes empirical evidence, the repetition of similar impressions across different contexts continues to draw attention from historians, psychologists, and cultural observers alike. One interpretive approach suggests that these experiences are best understood as a form of historical perception, a blending of cognitive expectation and environmental ambiguity shaped by the known weight of the site. In this view, Gettysburg does not produce anomalies. It produces interpretations. The landscape becomes a catalyst for meaning-making, where perception is continually adjusted by what is already known about the ground beneath one's feet. Another perspective frames these accounts in symbolic terms. The recurring sense of presence is seen not as an external phenomenon, but as an internal reflection of collective memory. The battlefield, in this sense, is not haunted by external forces, but saturated with narrative significance that the mind continuously reinterprets as experience. What is perceived becomes inseparable from what is remembered. There are also more speculative ideas that circulate outside formal historical analysis. These suggest that certain environments marked by extreme human events may retain subtle impressions of activity, not as physical residues, but as patterns of perception that occasionally align in ways that feel unusually coherent. While such interpretations remain unverified and largely philosophical in nature, they persist in cultural storytelling as a way of articulating experiences that resist simple categorization. What remains consistent across all accounts is not certainty, but recurrence. The experiences do not form a single event that can be investigated and concluded. Instead, they appear intermittently, across time, among different observers, in slightly varied forms. This makes them difficult to resolve, but easy to remember. And so, Gettysburg continues to exist in a dual condition. It is both a precisely documented historical site and a space where perception remains fluid. The physical landscape is stable. The interpretive experience is not. This tension is where the narrative quietly settles. As the lingering accounts of Gettysburg's ghost soldiers fade into the landscape of memory and interpretation, the narrative shifts once again, this time to another battlefield where silence and violence once collided in a single decisive moment. A place where the land itself seemed to absorb the shock of combat, leaving behind not only physical remnants of war, but reports of something far less easily explained. The setting moves to Sharpsburg, Maryland, along the Antietam Creek. Today, it is a quiet stretch of farmland and rolling terrain, marked by stone bridges, open fields, and carefully preserved historical landmarks. But on September 17, 1862, this landscape became the site of the single bloodiest day in American military history. In a matter of hours, thousands of soldiers fell across cornfields, sunken roads, and wooded edges as Union and Confederate forces clashed in a battle defined by fragmentation, confusion, and extreme intensity. In the aftermath, Antietam became a place of memory and preservation, much like Gettysburg. Yet alongside its documented history, there are recurring accounts of something less tangible, reports that have come to be known collectively as the strange lights of Antietam. These accounts do not emerge from official military documentation or wartime reports. Instead, they appear in later recollections, local testimonies, and modern visitor narratives describing unusual luminous phenomena observed over the battlefield, particularly in the hours of dusk or during quiet, low-visibility conditions. Descriptions vary, but certain patterns repeat. Some witnesses describe faint, drifting lights moving slowly across fields where no roads or settlements exist. Others report brief flashes or hovering points of illumination that appear and disappear without a discernible source. In some accounts, the lights seem to trace linear paths, as if following invisible routes across the terrain. In others, they appear stationary for moments before fading into darkness. Mainstream explanations for these reports tend to focus on environmental and atmospheric conditions. Antietam's geography includes open fields, low-lying areas near the creek, and varying humidity levels that can influence light refraction. Under certain conditions, distant light sources, such as vehicles, farms, or nearby roads, can be distorted by atmospheric layering, creating illusions of movement or displacement. Bioluminescence, insect activity, and reflective moisture in the air have also been suggested as possible contributors to perceived luminous effects. In rural environments with minimal light pollution, even small sources of illumination can appear unusually pronounced or distorted. Yet these explanations, while plausible, do not fully account for the consistency and specificity of certain accounts recorded over time. What makes the strange lights of Antietam particularly intriguing is not a single documented incident, but the recurrence of similar descriptions across different decades, reported by individuals with no apparent connection to one another. Some accounts come from park visitors, others from nighttime maintenance personnel, and still others from local residents familiar with the area. In some cases, the lights are described in proximity to historically significant locations on the battlefield, near Burnside's Bridge, along the sunken road, or across the open fields where major troop movements once occurred. This geographic repetition has led some observers to question whether the phenomenon is purely environmental or whether it is being interpreted through the lens of historical awareness. Mainstream historical interpretation remains cautious. The Antietam battlefield is a place of strong historical resonance, and the power of suggestion in such environments is well documented. When individuals visit sites associated with intense historical trauma, perception can become influenced by expectation, prior knowledge, and emotional context. In low-light conditions, the human eye is particularly susceptible to misinterpretation of distant or ambiguous visual stimuli. From this perspective, the strange lights may be understood as a combination of natural atmospheric effects and psychological interpretation shaped by historical significance. However, alternative interpretations continue to circulate, particularly within local storytelling traditions and broader cultural narratives surrounding historic battlefields. Some suggest that the lights represent residual environmental impressions, an idea rooted in the belief that locations of extreme historical intensity may retain traces of past events in ways not yet fully understood. In this view, the battlefield is not merely a static landscape, but a space where past and present occasionally overlap in perceptual experience. Others interpret the lights symbolically, as expressions of collective memory rather than physical phenomena. According to this perspective, the visual impressions reported at Antietam are manifestations of historical awareness made visible through the imagination, shaped by the emotional weight of the site and its documented past. There are also more speculative accounts that describe the lights as following patterns that resemble movement across known troop positions from the battle. These interpretations, while lacking empirical verification, often point to the striking coincidence between reported light activity and areas of documented historical engagement. What remains consistent across all interpretations is uncertainty, not only about what is being seen, but about how perception itself operates in environments saturated with historical meaning. Antietam, like many Civil War battlefields, exists simultaneously as physical space and historical narrative. It is mapped, preserved, and studied in detail, yet it is also experienced subjectively by those who visit it, each bringing their own understanding of what occurred there more than a century and a half ago. And so the question remains open, suspended between observation and interpretation. Are the strange lights of Antietam the result of natural atmospheric conditions interacting with a landscape rich in historical association? Or do they reflect something more complex about how memory, environment, and perception intersect in places marked by extreme human events? Like the battlefield itself, quiet now, but never fully separated from its past, the phenomenon resists a single explanation, lingering instead in the space between what is seen, what is known, and what remains uncertain. As the strange lights of Antietam fade into the quiet uncertainty of perception and memory, the narrative shifts once again, away from light moving across a battlefield and toward sound. A sound that does not belong to the present, yet is said to emerge within it, not seen, but heard. Not recorded in official dispatches, but carried through generations of testimony that refuse to settle into certainty. The setting returns to southwestern Tennessee, to the dense wooded terrain surrounding Shiloh Church along the Tennessee River. Today, it is a preserved military park, marked by interpretive signs, memorials, and carefully maintained trails. But in April 1862, it was a chaotic and unfamiliar landscape where visibility was limited, commands were fragmented, and sound itself became a critical element of survival. The Battle of Shiloh unfolded here over 2 days of intense combat, marked by surprise attacks, shifting lines, and extraordinary casualties. Amid the confusion of gunfire, artillery, and movement through dense forest, soldiers on both sides relied heavily on auditory cues, drums, bugle calls, shouted orders, to maintain coordination in an environment where sight was often unreliable. It is within this context that the story of the phantom drummer boy of Shiloh begins to appear. The accounts do not originate from official military records or wartime documentation. Instead, they emerge gradually in post-war recollections, oral traditions, and later historical narratives describing an unexplained drumming sound reported on or near the battlefield long after the fighting had ended. Descriptions vary, but a consistent pattern can be found across different versions of the story. Some accounts describe the faint sound of a drum echoing through wooded areas at night, distant yet distinct enough to be recognized as military in origin. Others describe rhythmic drumming that appears to move across the landscape, as if following invisible troop formations or traversing familiar battlefield routes. In some reports, the sound is brief and isolated. In others, it persists long enough to be clearly perceived before fading into silence. mainstream historical interpretation approaches these accounts with caution. The most widely accepted explanation is that they are products of environmental acoustics combined with psychological association. Dense forests, uneven terrain, and variable wind conditions can carry and distort sound in unexpected ways. In such environments, natural noises, branches shifting, animals moving, distant human activity, can be misinterpreted as structured rhythmic sounds, especially when filtered through the expectation of historical context. Shiloh, as a preserved battlefield, also carries a strong cognitive association with military soundscapes. Visitors arrive already aware of its history, primed to imagine the echoes of battle. In such settings, perception can become highly sensitive to ambiguous auditory stimuli. Yet what makes the story of the Phantom Drummer Boy endure is not a single isolated report, but the recurrence of similar descriptions over time. Across decades, visitors and park personnel have occasionally described hearing faint drumming in areas where no events or activities are taking place. These reports are typically brief, often occurring in quiet conditions, early morning, late evening, or in moments of low human activity on the grounds. In some cases, the sound is described as directional, seemingly moving across terrain associated with historical troop movements. In others, it appears stationary, as if originating from no identifiable source within the surrounding environment. There are no verified recordings of the phenomenon, and no official documentation confirming its existence as a physical acoustic event. As such, it remains firmly within the realm of anecdotal observation. From a historical perspective, one of the most grounded explanations is that these experiences reflect the nature of sound memory and environmental interpretation. Battlefields are spaces where historical imagination is particularly active. The brain, encountering ambiguous auditory input in a known historical setting, may unconsciously construct familiar patterns, such as marching rhythms or drum beats, based on expectation and context. Another explanation focuses on the acoustics of the terrain itself. The wooded and uneven landscape of Shiloh can produce echo effects, particularly under certain atmospheric conditions. Sound traveling across varying elevations and dense vegetation can be reflected, delayed, or fragmented in ways that create the impression of rhythmic repetition. As the strange lights of Antietam fade into the quiet uncertainty of perception and memory, the narrative shifts once more, away from light moving across a battlefield and toward sound. A sound that does not belong to the present, yet is said to emerge within it. Not seen, but heard. Not recorded in official dispatches, but carried through generations of testimony that refuse to settle into certainty. The setting returns to southwestern Tennessee, to the dense wooded terrain surrounding Shiloh Church along the Tennessee River. Today, it is a preserved military park, marked by interpretive signs, memorials, and carefully maintained trails. But in April 1862, it was a chaotic and unfamiliar landscape where visibility was limited, commands were fragmented, and sound itself became a critical element of survival. The Battle of Shiloh unfolded here over 2 days of intense combat, marked by surprise attacks, shifting lines, and extraordinary casualties. Amid the confusion of gunfire, artillery, and movement through dense forest, soldiers on both sides relied heavily on auditory cues, drums, bugle calls, shouted orders, to maintain coordination in an environment where sight was often unreliable. It is within this context that the story of the Phantom Drummer Boy of Shiloh begins to appear. The accounts do not originate from official military records or wartime documentation. Instead, they emerge gradually in post-war recollections, oral traditions, and later historical narratives describing an unexplained drumming sound reported on or near the battlefield long after the fighting had ended. Descriptions vary, but a consistent pattern can be found across different versions of the story. Some accounts describe the faint sound of a drum echoing through wooded areas at night, distant yet distinct enough to be recognized as military in origin. Others describe rhythmic drumming that appears to move across the landscape, as if following invisible troop formations or traversing familiar battlefield routes. In some reports, the sound is brief and isolated. In others, it persists long enough to be clearly perceived before fading into silence. Mainstream historical interpretation approaches these accounts with caution. The most widely accepted explanation is that they are products of environmental acoustics combined with psychological association. Dense forests, uneven terrain, and variable wind conditions can carry and distort sound in unexpected ways. In such environments, natural noises, branches shifting, animals moving, distant human activity, can be misinterpreted as structured rhythmic sounds, especially when filtered through the expectation of historical context. Shiloh, as a preserved battlefield, also carries a strong cognitive association with military soundscapes. Visitors arrive already aware of its history, primed to imagine the echoes of battle. In such settings, perception can become highly sensitive to ambiguous auditory stimuli. Yet what makes the story of the Phantom Drummer Boy endure is not a single isolated report, but the recurrence of similar descriptions over time. Across decades, visitors and park personnel have occasionally described hearing faint drumming in areas where no events or activities are taking place. These reports are typically brief, often occurring in quiet conditions, early morning, late evening, or in moments of low human activity on the grounds. In some cases, the sound is described as directional, seemingly moving across terrain associated with historical troop movements. In others, it appears stationary, as if originating from no identifiable source within the surrounding environment. There are no verified recordings of the phenomenon, and no official documentation confirming its existence as a physical acoustic event. As such, it remains firmly within the realm of anecdotal observation. From a historical perspective, one of the most grounded explanations is that these experiences reflect the nature of sound memory and environmental interpretation. Battlefields are spaces where historical imagination is particularly active. The brain, encountering ambiguous auditory input in a known historical setting, may unconsciously construct familiar patterns, such as marching rhythms or drum beats, based on expectation and context. Another explanation focuses on the acoustics of the terrain itself. The wooded and uneven landscape of Shiloh can produce echo effects, particularly under certain atmospheric conditions. Sound traveling across varying elevations and dense vegetation can be reflected, delayed, or fragmented in ways that create the impression of rhythmic repetition. However, these explanations do not fully account for the emotional consistency with which the phenomenon is described. Reports of the phantom drumming are often accompanied by a sense of unease or presence, an impression that the sound is not merely heard, but associated with something beyond immediate environmental conditions. This has led some interpretations into more symbolic territory. In these readings, the Phantom Drummer Boy is not understood as a literal entity, but as a representation of collective memory, an auditory expression of the thousands of soldiers who moved, fought, and died in the dense forests of Shiloh. The drum, in this sense, becomes less an instrument and more a metaphor for the structured chaos of battle, echoing through memory long after the physical conflict has ended. There are also more speculative traditions, often found in local storytelling and informal historical reflection, which suggest that certain battlefield environments may preserve impressions of past activity in ways not yet fully understood. Within this framework, the drumming is interpreted not as sound traveling through time, but as a perceptual overlap between present conditions and historical imprint. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the absence of definitive resolution. There is no recorded drummer boy whose identity matches these accounts, no military record indicating continued drumming activity after the battle, and no physical evidence confirming the presence of an ongoing acoustic source. And yet, the story persists. It persists because Shiloh itself remains a place where history is not only studied, but experienced in layered form. The battlefield is quiet now, but it is a silence shaped by what once filled it: movement, command, urgency, and sound. And so the question remains suspended in that silence. Is the phantom drummer boy of Shiloh a product of memory, environment, and perception converging within a historically charged landscape? Or does it reflect something more subtle about how places of intense human experience continue to resonate within those who walk through them long after the events have passed? Like the battlefield itself, the answer does not settle easily. It lingers, faint, rhythmic, and just beyond the edge of certainty. As the faint, imagined rhythm of the phantom drummer boy fades back into the stillness of Shiloh's forests, the narrative shifts once again, away from sound that may or may not belong to memory, and toward something even more elusive: presence without form. Not a voice, not a drum, not a movement that can be traced with certainty, but a sense that something remains where history insists it should have ended. From Tennessee's shadowed woodlands, the focus drifts across the broader landscape of the American Civil War itself. A war defined not only by its documented battles and recorded losses, but by the countless moments that slipped through the cracks of record-keeping, perception, and time. In many ways, it is not the known events that define its lingering mysteries, but the spaces between them. Throughout the war, soldiers on both sides described experiences that defied easy categorization. Strange impressions in the fog of battle, brief visual distortions on distant ridgelines, moments of confusion where formations seemed to appear and disappear in ways later maps could not fully explain. Most of these accounts were never formally recorded, or if they were filed away as misperception under extreme conditions. Mainstream historical interpretation approaches these experiences with a consistent framework. The battlefield is an environment of intense cognitive strain. Smoke obscures vision. Noise overwhelms orientation. Fear compresses time and distorts memory. Under such conditions, the human mind reconstructs incomplete information into familiar patterns. What is not fully seen becomes interpreted. What is not fully understood becomes remembered in symbolic form. Yet even within this framework, some accounts resist simple closure. There are descriptions, scattered, inconsistent, and often retrospective, of moments where soldiers claimed to perceive movements that did not align with visible forces, shapes in the distance that dissolved when approached, sounds that seemed to originate from areas later confirmed to be empty. These are not uniform reports, nor are they supported by physical evidence, but they appear often enough in personal letters and memoirs to form a subtle pattern within the broader noise of wartime documentation. Some historians suggest these accounts reflect the psychological intensity of prolonged conflict. Others propose that they are narrative reconstructions, shaped after the fact by memory, attempting to impose structure on chaos. In either case, they remain part of the human record of the war, even if they do not fit neatly within its operational history. More speculative interpretations occasionally frame these inconsistencies differently, not as errors in perception alone, but as signs of how deeply environments become imprinted by extreme human events. In this view, battlefields are not simply locations where events occurred, but layered spaces where experience, memory, and interpretation continuously overlap. What is perceived, then, is not only the present moment, but the weight of what once happened there. Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, these names are often treated as fixed points in time. But on the ground, they are places that continue to exist, physically unchanged in many respects, yet conceptually altered by everything that has been written, spoken, and remembered about them. Visitors do not arrive in empty landscapes. They arrive in places already filled with meaning, and meaning, once established, can subtly shape perception. This is where the mystery becomes less about a single phenomenon and more about a broader question. How much of what is experienced in historically charged environments is perception responding to present stimuli, and how much is interpretation shaped by accumulated narrative? There is no definitive record that resolves this tension, no instrument capable of measuring memory as it interacts with place, no archive that can separate sensation from suggestion once both have been layered over time. And so the uncertainty remains, not as a single unanswered question, but as a persistent condition. Because the Civil War, in its documented form, ended in 1865. But in its less visible form, it continues to exist wherever memory, landscape, and imagination overlap. And in that overlap, the line between what is observed and what is understood does not fully hold. It simply fades, quietly, gradually, into everything that came after. As the faint echoes of the phantom drummer boy dissolve into the silence of Shiloh's wooded terrain, the narrative shifts once again, away from sound that may or may not belong to memory, and towards something more tangible. Wood, iron, leather, and weight. The physical machinery of war moving across roads that were never fully secure, carrying not only soldiers and supplies, but the fragile economic lifeblood of an army in retreat. The setting moves to the rural road networks of the late Confederate South during the final years of the Civil War. These were not the wide, maintained highways of modern infrastructure, but uneven dirt paths cutting through forests, farmland, and small settlements. In dry seasons, they became dusty and unstable. In rain, they turned into slow, muddy channels that could trap even well-equipped wagons. It is along one of these routes that the story of the lost Confederate payroll wagon emerges. In principle, military payroll wagons were straightforward logistical assets. They carried currency, often in the form of gold coin, paper money, or treasury notes, intended to pay soldiers in the field. These wagons were typically assigned escorts, usually small detachments of cavalry or infantry, responsible for ensuring safe delivery from administrative centers to military units. Records confirm that such shipments were a regular necessity for both Union and Confederate forces. Armies required consistent payment systems to maintain morale, discipline, and operational stability, especially during extended campaigns far from centralized supply hubs. Yet, within the final and most chaotic phase of the war, references appear to a Confederate payroll transport that never reached its intended destination. The details are fragmented. Some accounts suggest a wagon carrying payroll funds assigned to Confederate troops operating in contested regions. Others describe a broader logistical movement of financial resources being transferred between administrative points as Confederate command structures shifted under pressure. What remains consistent is the outcome. The wagon disappeared from the historical record before completing its documented journey. Mainstream historical interpretation attributes such losses to the breakdown of infrastructure and command control in the final months of the Confederacy. As Union forces advanced, transportation routes became increasingly unstable. Bridges were destroyed, towns were evacuated, and communication between units became unreliable or entirely severed. In this environment, a payroll wagon, no matter how carefully planned, could easily be delayed, rerouted, or lost entirely. Escorts might become separated from command. Roads could become impassable. In some cases, wagons were abandoned when survival or strategic retreat took priority over delivery. From this perspective, the lost payroll wagon is not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of collapsing logistical systems under wartime stress. And yet, the mystery persists because no clear resolution appears in surviving records. Unlike other documented logistical failures that were later explained through military reports or post-war audits, this particular payroll shipment leaves behind only indirect references. There is no definitive accounting of its contents, no confirmed arrival, and no documented recovery of the funds it was believed to carry. This absence has led historians to consider several possibilities. One interpretation suggests that the wagon may have been physically lost during transit, intercepted, destroyed, or abandoned in terrain that was never fully searched or documented afterward. In rural wartime conditions, especially during the Confederacy's final months, such outcomes were not uncommon. Wagons could become stuck in mud, break down under load, or be separated from escorts under pressure from nearby military activity. Another explanation focuses on administrative discontinuity. As Confederate governmental structures collapsed, record-keeping became increasingly fragmented. A shipment recorded at departure might never have been formally logged as lost or received due to the breakdown of administrative continuity. In this scenario, the wagon may not have vanished physically, but bureaucratically, its existence fading from official record due to incomplete documentation. There are also interpretations that consider intentional diversion. In wartime conditions where loyalty, survival, and shifting allegiances overlapped, it is theoretically possible that valuable shipments could have been redirected by individuals or small groups acting independently. While there is no direct evidence confirming such an event in this specific case, the broader instability of the period makes it a consideration within historical analysis. More speculative accounts, often rooted in local tradition and post-war storytelling, describe the possibility of concealed burial or hiding of the wagon's contents. In these narratives, payroll funds are said to have been hidden temporarily with the intention of later recovery, an intention that may never have been fulfilled due to the rapid collapse of Confederate administrative structures. These accounts, while lacking verification, reflect a broader cultural pattern of interpreting wartime losses as hidden rather than simply destroyed. What complicates any definitive conclusion is the nature of Confederate logistics in the war's final phase. By this point, transportation networks were severely degraded. Rail lines were disrupted, river routes were contested or controlled, and overland movement depended heavily on local conditions and improvised coordination. In such an environment, even well-documented shipments could easily fall outside the reach of reliable record-keeping. The lost Confederate payroll wagon, therefore, exists at the intersection of logistics and collapse, a system designed for precision operating under conditions that made precision increasingly impossible. And yet, its absence continues to invite reflection. Because beyond the question of what happened to a single wagon lies a broader question about how many similar losses went unrecorded. How many shipments, deliveries, and transfers disappeared not through dramatic events, but through gradual erosion of oversight during a collapsing war economy? The wagon itself becomes less a singular object and more a symbol of transitional instability, where movement existed without certainty and where value in transit could easily slip beyond the reach of documentation. So the question remains open, suspended along those unrecorded roads. Was the lost Confederate payroll wagon a victim of physical misfortune on unstable wartime terrain, an administrative disappearance in a collapsing record system, or an untraceable event absorbed into the broader chaos of retreat and dissolution? And if it still existed in some forgotten place along those old routes, would it now be recognizable as anything more than debris of a vanished logistical world? Like so many mysteries of the Civil War, it does not conclude with resolution. It lingers instead in the spaces between movement and record, where history once passed, but was never fully secured. And when we follow that idea a little further, away from the single wagon, away from its unknown destination, we begin to see that it may never have been an isolated case at all. The lost Confederate payroll wagon, in many ways, becomes a lens through which an entire system can be re-examined, a wartime economy stretched beyond its limits, attempting to function with precision in a landscape that was steadily losing its structure. By the final years of the Civil War, Confederate logistics were no longer operating as a unified machine. They were fragments of one, temporary solutions layered over deteriorating infrastructure. Supply officers worked with incomplete inventories. Couriers carried verbal instructions where written orders were too dangerous or too slow. Entire departments shifted locations multiple times in a matter of weeks, sometimes leaving behind records that would never be formally retrieved. In such conditions, the concept of a single lost shipment begins to feel less like an exception and more like a recurring possibility. Payroll wagons, in particular, occupied a sensitive position within this system. They were not merely transport vehicles. They represented trust made physical. Each one carried the expectation that soldiers would be compensated, that discipline could be maintained through something as fragile as currency moving across unstable terrain. When that chain broke, when delivery failed, or records did not return, the consequences were not always immediately visible in official documentation. Sometimes they surfaced only later, in shortages, disputes, or unexplained gaps in financial summaries. This is part of what makes the story so persistent. The absence is not dramatic in a single moment. It is distributed across many. Some historians suggest that this distribution of loss is precisely why cases like the payroll wagon remain unresolved. In a functioning system, failure is recorded, investigated, and closed. But in a collapsing one, failure often dissolves into background noise. A wagon does not arrive. A ledger is never reconciled. A unit reports incomplete payment, but no central authority remains stable enough to follow through on the discrepancy. Over time, these unresolved fragments blend into the broader chaos of the war's final phase. Still, there are moments in the historical record where the silence feels unusually sharp. Occasional post-war recollections, letters written years after the conflict, hint at missing funds, unaccounted transfers, or shipments that never reached their destination and were never explained. These accounts are often too vague to confirm, yet too consistent in pattern to dismiss entirely. They suggest a shared experience of uncertainty among those who lived through the collapse of Confederate administration. And this is where interpretation begins to widen. Some researchers view these gaps as evidence of systemic breakdown alone, the inevitable result of infrastructure under sustained military pressure. Others consider whether the disappearance of financial assets might occasionally have involved smaller human decisions, choices made in isolation, under pressure, without documentation. Not coordinated schemes, but scattered actions across a fractured environment where oversight was no longer guaranteed. There are also those who approach the subject more cautiously, emphasizing that absence in the record does not automatically imply concealment. In wartime conditions, especially in the rural and contested regions of the Confederacy, the simple act of transport was itself a high-risk operation. Weather, terrain, military engagement, and logistical miscommunication all carried the potential to erase a shipment without any deliberate intervention at all. Yet even with these explanations layered together, something remains unresolved, not necessarily in fact, but in narrative completeness. The mind continues to return to the image of movement without arrival. Wagons leaving administrative centers, moving through roads already breaking down under the weight of war, entering regions where communication becomes less certain with every mile. And then, nothing. No arrival record, no recovery log, no definitive closure. Only absence, repeated in different forms across different accounts. So the lost Confederate payroll wagon becomes something larger than its original definition. It is no longer just a logistical incident. It becomes a representation of a system losing its ability to confirm its own actions in real time. A moment in history where movement could still occur, but verification could no longer keep pace with it. And perhaps that is where the enduring uncertainty comes from. Because once a system can no longer reliably record its own outcomes, every missing element begins to carry the same quiet question. Was it lost in transit, lost in documentation, or lost in the space where both begin to mean the same thing?